What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you most spent their entire lives pretending you didn't exist? And what if, on the one night they finally couldn't ignore you, everything they'd built came crashing down? My name is Claire Hartwell. For 34 years, I was the invisible daughter, the one who didn't matter, the one who was never supposed to make it. And on the night of my brother Brandon's engagement party, standing just 10 feet away from my father as he raised his champagne glass and called Brandon the only successful child this family has ever produced, I was wearing 14 years of sacrifice on my hand, in the form of a Georgetown medical ring that nobody in that room knew I'd earned. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman Brandon was about to marry was the same woman I had pulled back from the edge of death 3 years earlier on my operating table. But to understand that night, you have to understand the house I grew up in. We lived in McLean, Virginia, one of those picture-perfect suburbs outside Washington, D.C., where every lawn was manicured, every driveway held a luxury car, and every family had secrets hidden behind freshly painted shutters. My father, Richard Hartwell, was CFO of a mid-sized insurance company. He wore the same pale blue Oxford shirt every single day, pressed and starched, paired with a Rolex Datejust he'd bought himself the morning he got promoted. That watch was his trophy, his proof that hard work paid off, for the right kind of person. In our house, there were rules, not the kind anyone wrote down, the kind you learned by watching. Brandon got dropped off at school in my father's Lexus. I took the bus. When Brandon's grades slipped in math, a private tutor appeared within the week. When I asked for the same, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Girls just need to get by," he said. "You don't need that." Brandon's baseball games were family events. My father in the front row, my mother with her camera, everyone cheering. My academic awards? My mother came once. My father never did. Not once. I remember the day I came home with the highest math score in my entire school. I was 12 years old, and I was so proud I could barely breathe. I walked into the living room and held up my test paper. My father glanced at it for half a second, then set it down on the coffee table. "Has Brandon scheduled his makeup exam yet?" he asked. "That boy needs to focus." I stood there holding that perfect score, and something quietly closed inside me. I learned that day that in this house, my achievements would always be invisible, so I made myself invisible too. Until the night I decided I was done. The summer before my freshman year of college, my mother made meatloaf for dinner. She only made meatloaf when something important was about to happen. I was 18. I'd just received my acceptance letter from the University of Virginia, a partial scholarship that covered most of my tuition, but I still needed $16,000 a year to make it work. I remember smoothing that letter flat on the dining table, my heart pounding with a hope I was almost too afraid to feel. My father picked it up. He didn't read it. He glanced at the university logo, set it down next to his glass of Macallan, and swirled the whiskey like he was making a business decision. Because to him, that's exactly what it was. "That money is for Brandon," he said. "Your brother will need a real career someday. He'll have a family to support." Then he finally looked at me. "You just need to find yourself a good husband, Claire." Brandon was 15, hunched over his phone across the table, pretending not to hear. He didn't say a word. My mother Margaret sat perfectly still, her fingers wrapped so tight around her fork that her knuckles had gone white. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ice cracking in my father's glass. I folded that letter slowly, slid it into my pocket, and said the only 2 words I could manage. "Okay, Dad." The calmest words I ever spoke, and the last time I ever asked my father for anything. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream into my pillow. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started searching for part-time jobs near campus. I submitted 3 applications before midnight. Because in that silence at the dinner table, I had made a decision, one that would take 14 years to fully unfold. And on the night of my brother's engagement party, every single person in that ballroom was about to find out exactly what that decision had built. That night at the dinner table didn't break me. It lit something inside me that would burn for the next 14 years. From the moment I folded that letter and walked away, I stopped waiting for permission. I stopped waiting for anyone to believe in me. I became the only person I was ever going to be able to count on, and I got to work. College was a blur of alarm clocks and cold coffee, and a body that never fully rested. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously throughout all 4 years. My first shift started at 5 in the morning at a diner 2 blocks from campus. I'd pour coffee for truckers and early commuters until 9, then run straight to my first class, still smelling like grease and maple syrup. In the afternoons, I worked at the university library, stamping due dates and shelving books while quietly reading my organic chemistry notes between check-ins. And on weekends, I tutored high school students in math, the exact same service my father had refused to pay for when I needed it most. There was a particular satisfaction in that. Not bitterness, just a quiet, private kind of justice. I averaged 5 hours of sleep a night. I never went home for the holidays. I told my mother I had extra shifts, which was always true. What I didn't tell her was that I couldn't sit at that table and watch my family celebrate a son who had everything handed to him while I was out earning every single thing I owned. One February night during my junior year, I finished a tutoring session at 10 o'clock and started biking back to my dorm in the middle of a snowstorm. My front tire went flat a mile from campus. I got off, put my head down, and walked that bike 2 kilometers through the dark and the cold until my fingers went numb and my jeans were soaked through to the skin. When I finally got back to my room, I changed my clothes, sat down at my desk, and opened my organic chemistry textbook. It was almost midnight. I studied until 2 in the morning, not because I wasn't exhausted, but because I knew, if I stopped, if I let myself sink, my father would be right about me. And that was the one thing I refused to give him. I wore the same pair of sneakers for 2 full years. When the sole started separating from the toe, I bought a tube of superglue from the dollar store and pressed it back together. Those shoes carried me through lecture halls and library shifts and late-night study sessions, and eventually, they carried me across the graduation stage. Summa cum laude. GPA 3.97, top of my class. I sent my parents an invitation to the ceremony 6 weeks in advance. My mother texted back 2 days later. "Honey, Brandon has his championship game that afternoon. We'll celebrate with you soon, I promise." I sat in the 3rd row in my cap and gown, surrounded by hundreds of families cheering for their kids, and I watched other people's parents cry happy tears and wave handmade signs. When the dean called my name, I walked up alone, shook his hand, and accepted my diploma in front of a crowd that didn't contain a single person who loved me. Afterward, a custodian who was already stacking chairs in the back of the hall looked up as I passed and said, "Congratulations, future doctor." I made it all the way to my car before I started crying. 15 minutes. Then I dried my face, drove to the library, and returned the 3 overdue books I'd almost forgotten about. I applied to 14 medical schools. 4 accepted me. I chose Georgetown University Medical Center, not because it had the most prestigious name, though it did, but because they offered the strongest financial aid package, and I had learned by then how to make every dollar count. 4 years of medical school, 6 years of residency, 2 years of fellowship, 14 years in total, building something from nothing, in a field that breaks most of the people who enter it. I specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, one of the most demanding, most unforgiving disciplines in all of medicine. Colleagues I'd started with quietly left the program, one by one, transferring to less grueling specialties or stepping away entirely. I stayed. Not to prove anything to my father. I stayed because every single time I held a human heart in my hands, every time I watched a flat line curve back into a rhythm, I knew with complete certainty that this was what I was put on this earth to do. By 33, I was a board-certified attending cardiothoracic surgeon at Georgetown Medical Center, published in peer-reviewed journals, respected by colleagues across the country. On the day I received my Georgetown medical ring, I sat alone in a small ceremony room under fluorescent lights and slid it onto my own finger. No one was there to witness it, but every time I scrubbed in for surgery after that, I would look down at that ring and remember exactly where I had come from, and how far I had walked to get here, in shoes held together with glue. My family knew almost nothing about any of it. My mother knew I worked at a hospital somewhere in DC. That was the extent of it. She never asked for more. And for a long time, I told myself that was fine. Then one Tuesday evening, my phone lit up with her name at 9 o'clock at night, and everything I had spent 14 years quietly outrunning came rushing back through the door. My mother only called late at night when she didn't want my father to hear her. That Tuesday evening, I was standing in my kitchen unwinding after a 12-hour shift when my phone lit up with her name at 9 o'clock, and the moment I heard her voice, low, careful, barely above a whisper, I knew something was coming. She told me Brandon was engaged. She told me the party was being held at the Potomac Ridge Club, one of those old money establishments outside D.C., where annual membership ran $60,000, and every handshake was worth something. 170 guests. All of my father's business contacts, his golf circle, the people whose opinions shaped his entire sense of self-worth. And then she said the thing that stopped me cold. Your father doesn't want anyone introducing you as a doctor, sweetheart. Just come as Brandon's sister. Keep it simple. There was no formal invitation. My name wasn't on any guest list. You can come if you want, she said, as though she were offering me a seat at a table that had already been cleared. I asked her quietly, Mom, am I actually invited? The line went silent, for just long enough to give me my answer. I stood there afterward looking at my calendar on the wall. No surgeries scheduled for Saturday evening. The smart part of me, the part that had spent 14 years learning how to protect herself, said to decline, to stay home, to let them have their perfect night without me in it. But there was another part of me, smaller and older, the part that was still 18 years old and folding a letter in silence at a dinner table, and that part needed to go. Not to be recognized, not to make a scene, just to stop running. So I booked an Uber, put on a simple navy dress, and wore my Georgetown medical ring on my right hand the way I always did, not to show off, just because it was mine, and I had earned it, and I was done apologizing for the things I had built. The Potomac Ridge Club looked exactly the way you'd expect a $60,000 a year membership to look. White Georgian architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with warm chandelier light, a sprawling golf course disappearing into the darkness beyond the manicured lawn. I took the Uber because I didn't want anyone asking questions about my car, my job, my life. I just wanted to slip in quietly, pay my respects, and leave before anything could go wrong. But at the entrance, the security guard in his pressed blazer ran his finger down the clipboard twice, then looked up with a slight frown. My name was not on the list. I called my mother. She appeared at the front door less than 2 minutes later, her face flushed with that particular shade of embarrassment that comes from being caught doing something you know is wrong. She touched the guard's arm and said, "She's with me. She's my daughter." My daughter. The words landed strangely, like something spoken in a language she didn't use very often. I followed her inside without a word. My father saw me the moment I stepped into the ballroom. His eyes found mine across the crowd, and for just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face. Recognition, discomfort, calculation, before it smoothed back into the polished expression he wore at every professional event of his life. He gave me a single nod. No embrace, no welcome, not even my name. Then he turned back to the man beside him, and I heard him say, without missing a beat, "Just a distant relative." I walked straight to the bar and ordered sparkling water with lime. I held that glass and stood near the back of the room and told myself to breathe. At precisely 8 o'clock, the lights shifted, and a spotlight found the small stage at the front of the ballroom. My father stepped up to the microphone with a champagne flute in one hand and that Rolex catching the light on his wrist, and the room quieted the way rooms do when powerful men prepare to speak. His voice was warm and practiced, and completely at ease. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate Brandon Hartwell, the pride of this family, the only successful child we have ever raised." 170 people applauded. I stood 10 feet away, my sparkling water untouched, and felt the air leave my lungs in a slow, silent exhale. He kept going. "Brandon is on the verge of completing his medical residency and becoming a doctor. Proof that when you invest in the right person, the return is extraordinary." A few women near the front, friends of my mother's, I thought, glanced back toward me, with something careful in their eyes. One of them leaned toward her husband and murmured, "I didn't realize they had a daughter." I held my glass and said nothing. I had spent 14 years building a career that could stop a human heart and start it again. Last week, I'd done exactly that. A 52-year-old man, flatlined on my table, and I had stood there with absolute calm and brought him back. I could hold a stranger's heart in my hands and not flinch. But standing in that ballroom listening to my father erase me in front of everyone who had ever mattered to him, that was a different kind of pain entirely. Something older. Something that lived in the bones. I set my glass down on a nearby table and turned toward the exit. And that was the moment I noticed her. A woman in a cream silk dress, standing just a few feet away, completely still, staring at my right hand. At my ring. Before I could take another step, she moved toward me, her voice quiet and slightly unsteady. "Excuse me, do you work at Georgetown Medical? Are you a surgeon?" And in the space of that single breath, I looked at her face and felt something shift deep in my memory. Because I knew those eyes. I had looked into them once before, in a recovery room, at 2 in the morning, 8 hours after I had fought to keep her alive. I looked at her face, and the memory came back to me the way memories do in emergency rooms. Fast, precise, and completely certain. 3 years earlier, 2 in the morning, a 27-year-old woman had been wheeled into my operating room after a delivery truck ran a red light and hit her driver's side door at nearly 60 miles an hour. Her sternum was shattered. She had massive internal bleeding. The trauma team gave her an 18% chance of surviving the night. I spent 8 hours in that operating room, and there were moments, more than one, when I thought we were going to lose her. But I didn't let go. I held on, and eventually, so did she. I said her name quietly, almost to myself. Sophia. Sophia Caldwell. She covered her mouth with both hands, and her eyes filled with tears so fast it looked like something breaking open. "It's you," she whispered. "Oh my God, it's actually you." Before either of us could say another word, Brandon appeared at her side, sliding his arm around her waist with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Babe, what's going on?" Sophia looked up at him, still visibly shaken. "Do you know what your sister does for a living?" Brandon glanced at me for just a fraction of a second, then gave a casual shrug. "Yeah, she works in hospital administration, some kind of coordinator role." Sophia turned to me slowly, as if she needed a moment to process what she'd just heard. "Administration?" I looked at my brother, and kept my voice completely level. "Brandon, you know exactly what I do." He reached for Sophia's hand and pivoted immediately. "Babe, come on. Mr. Davidson from Dad's old firm has been waiting to meet you. We should go say hello." Sophia pulled her hand back. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. My father materialized beside us within seconds, the way he always did when he sensed something threatening his carefully constructed evening. His voice was low and controlled. "Is there a problem here?" Sophia looked at him directly. "Mr. Hartwell, your daughter is a surgeon, isn't she?" My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Claire works at a hospital, but tonight isn't the time or place to discuss that." And then, from just a few steps away, a man's voice cut through the tension. It was Dr. Robert Langston, a cardiologist I recognized as one of my father's longtime golf partners, and he was looking at me with unmistakable recognition. "Is that Claire Hartwell? I attended her presentation on minimally invasive mitral valve repair at the AHA conference last year. Remarkable research." My father smiled the way he always smiled when something was slipping out of his control. Tight, practiced, revealed nothing. "We're a private family, Robert." I looked at my father then and said, quietly enough that only he could hear me, "Private. Or just embarrassed." He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all evening, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger. It was something that looked a great deal like the ground shifting underneath him. Brandon reappeared at my elbow a moment later and pulled me toward a corner of the room, away from the nearest cluster of guests. His voice dropped to a sharp, pressured whisper. "What exactly do you think you're doing? This is my engagement party. You weren't even supposed to be here tonight." I kept my eyes on his and didn't move. "You're right that I wasn't invited, Brandon. I came because Mom asked me to, and I have been standing here quietly all evening." He held my gaze for one cold second. "Then keep standing there quietly," he said, and walked away. I turned back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the golf course, watching the landscape lights cast long golden lines across the dark grass, and I thought seriously about pulling out my phone and ordering that Uber home. Then my phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from Dr. James Whitfield, a colleague from Georgetown. Random question. Is Brandon Hartwell your brother? I just ran into him at a MedAxis Pharmaceuticals conference last week. I thought he was still finishing his residency. I stared at the screen. Then I opened a browser and typed in his name. The results loaded in seconds. Brandon Hartwell, Senior Sales Representative, MedAxis Pharmaceuticals. A LinkedIn profile, a company directory listing, a conference speaker biography, dated 8 months ago. No medical license, no board certification, no residency completion. He had walked away from his program 2 years earlier, and for 2 full years, my father had been standing in rooms exactly like this one, telling anyone who would listen that his son was about to become a doctor. $195,000. And Brandon had not finished. I slid my phone back into my clutch and stood very still. I hadn't gone looking for this, and I wasn't going to use it as ammunition, but I had barely finished that thought when I heard footsteps and looked up to find Sophia walking toward me with a different expression on her face than the one she'd worn 10 minutes ago. This one was quieter, harder. She stopped in front of me and said, "He told me he was finishing his residency. All those nights he came home late. I thought he was pulling hospital shifts." She looked across the room to where Brandon was laughing at something, completely at ease, surrounded by people who believed every word he said. She watched him for a long moment, then she turned back to me. "Will you stay? I need you here for this." I asked her if she was sure. She looked at me steadily and said, 3 years ago, you asked me if I wanted to fight." Her voice was calm and absolutely certain. "It's my turn now." The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone and asked for the room's attention, announcing that the bride-to-be would like to say a few words. Sophia walked to the stage in her cream silk dress, and 170 people fell quiet. She didn't rush. She didn't waver. She told them about the accident. The truck, the intersection, the shattered sternum, the 8 hours of surgery, the 18% chance. She told them that the surgeon who had saved her life was standing in this room tonight. And then she pointed directly at me. Her name is Dr. Claire Hartwell. She is a board-certified cardiothoracic surgeon at Georgetown Medical Center. She is also Brandon's sister. 170 heads turned toward me at once. Sophia's voice stayed completely even as she continued. And yet just 1 hour ago, Mr. Hartwell stood on this very stage and introduced Brandon as the only successful child this family has ever produced. I would like someone to explain that to me. The applause started somewhere near the back of the room. Slowly at first, then steadily building, rolling forward through the crowd like a wave that had been waiting a very long time to reach the shore. Sophia looked at me from the stage and extended her hand. For the first time in 34 years, Claire Hartwell did not step backward toward the wall. She walked toward the light. I walked up those 3 steps and stood in the light. And for a moment I simply looked out at the room. 170 faces looking back at me. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some quietly waiting to see what I would do. I had 2 choices in that moment. I could shrink, the way I had been shrinking my entire life inside this family. Or I could just tell the truth. I took a breath, the same slow, deliberate breath I take before the first incision, and I spoke. "I came here tonight to celebrate my brother's engagement. That's the only reason I'm standing here." I paused and let that land. But I won't pretend to be something I'm not. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I have spent 14 years building this career entirely on my own, without a single dollar of family support. My voice stayed steady. I'm not saying that to make anyone feel guilty. I'm saying it because the truth deserves to be spoken out loud. In rooms exactly like this one. I set the microphone back on the stand, stepped back, and the room exhaled into applause. That was when Brandon came apart. He stormed onto the stage with his face flushed dark red, his carefully styled hair beginning to fall forward, his composure completely gone. "Are you serious right now?" he snapped, jabbing a finger in my direction. "This is my night. You always do this. You always have to make everything about you, every single time." I didn't move toward him. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him and said, very quietly, "Brandon, when were you planning to tell everyone that you left your residency program 2 years ago?" The room went absolutely silent, not the polite quiet of people being courteous, the stunned, airless silence of a room where something true has just been said that cannot be unsaid. "You are not becoming a doctor," I continued. "You are a senior sales representative at MedAxis Pharmaceuticals. You have been for 2 years. Our father spent $195,000 on your education, and you did not finish." Brandon opened his mouth and nothing came out. My father stepped forward from the edge of the stage, his voice taut and controlled. "This is a misunderstanding." And then Dr. Robert Langston's voice came from somewhere in the middle of the room, calm and unsparing. "Harold, I just pulled up his LinkedIn profile on my phone. There is no misunderstanding here." The whispering that swept through the crowd was low and immediate, like wind moving through dry grass. Brandon stood in the center of the stage under the full weight of the spotlight, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Sophia walked toward him slowly, without any urgency, the way someone moves when they have already made their decision and no longer need to rush. She slid the engagement ring from her finger, took his trembling hand in both of hers, and placed it in his palm. Her voice was quiet and completely final. "I asked you for one thing, Brandon. Just one. Never lie to me." She folded his fingers closed around the ring. "You've been lying to me since the day we met." She turned and walked off the stage without looking back, her heels striking the marble floor in a steady rhythm that echoed across the entire room. Brandon stood alone in the spotlight, his hands slowly opening, and the ring slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a small, sharp sound that seemed impossibly loud in that silence. No one moved to pick it up. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, slow and deliberate, and I turned to find my mother climbing onto the stage. Margaret Hartwell, who had spent her entire adult life smoothing things over and staying invisible, and never once making a scene, was standing under those lights with red-rimmed eyes and mascara tracing faint lines down her cheeks. She looked at me the way she had looked at me when I was very small, before the silence between us grew too large to cross. "Claire," she said, and her voice broke on just that one word. "I owe you an apology that is long overdue." She told me she had followed my career from a distance for years, that she had read my published research, that she had seen every hospital announcement, every promotion, every milestone, and had never said a word to anyone, including me. "You were 18 years old," she said, "and I sat at that table and let your father tell you that you didn't matter. I was supposed to protect you, and I failed you." She reached for me, and I let her pull me into her arms, and it was the first real embrace I could remember from her in more years than I could count. Warm and imperfect, and long overdue. Behind us, my father stood at the edge of the stage in complete silence. Richard Hartwell, the man who had commanded every room he had ever entered, who had never once been without a response, had nothing left to say. A lot can change in 7 days. Sophia sent me a message the morning after the party. "Thank you for telling me the truth. Starting over is terrifying, but it is so much better than building a life on a lie." Brandon confessed everything to my father later that week. My father cut off his financial support until, as he put it, Brandon came to him with a real plan. My mother enrolled in family counseling and asked my father to join her. He refused for several days. Then, after a week of silence from nearly everyone in his life, he agreed to one session. I don't know what the future holds for any of them. The following Monday, I was back in the operating room at 7 in the morning for a coronary bypass. I scrubbed in, felt the familiar cold of the surgical suite, breathed in the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic, and stood under the bright white light of the operating lamp. 4 hours later, my patient's heart began beating again on its own, that first strong, steady rhythm after everything it had been through, and I felt what I always feel in that moment. Not pride, not validation, just purpose, clear and absolute. This is why I do what I do. Not for recognition, not for a room full of people finally knowing my name. For this, for one more person who gets to go home. 3 days after the party, a text came from a number I didn't recognize. It said simply, "This is your father. Can we talk?" I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed back, "When you're ready to really listen, I'll be here." I meant it. The real victory of that night was never the applause, never the moment Sophia said my name in front of 170 people. The real victory happened years before any of that, in a parking lot after a graduation ceremony, where no one came, when I dried my face and decided to keep going anyway. If you are watching this, and you recognize yourself in this story, the overlooked child, the one who was never quite enough, the one who built everything alone, while someone else got all the credit, I want you to hear this clearly. You are enough. You have always been enough. Don't wait for them to see it. See it in yourself first. And if you're wondering what happened next with Richard Hartwell, the man who spent $195,000 on his son and not one single dollar on his daughter, I promise you, the answer will surprise you. But that is a story for another time.